Hello out there. Welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. My name is Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Kaplan, and we're going to be going through the books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, over the course of this year. And we'll just do a little bit every day. We're doing the traditional readings. They break them up into seven and into a weekly portion. So if you have friends or people that go to a traditional synagogue, you're going to be following along right with them. Now today we're going to be doing Genesis 28:10 through 22. But before I do that, I want to bring up that we had a question. We had a question about one of our former readings, and that was about the story of Lot. And the person wanted to know why Lot did not go back to live with Abraham.
Well, first of all, it's something he could have done, or maybe not. Could not. Not. It's sort of one of those things. Could have gone either way. I would say by that time they'd been separated for a while. He had his own distinct identity at that point. Now he had children by his daughters, and perhaps he felt that he should continue with his own separate identity rather than return to Abraham with that kind of situation there. Um, well, it's interesting though. You did bring up something interesting that after that account, we don't hear about what happened to him later. We don't, as far as I know, it's not recorded where he finally settled down, and it's not recorded where he died or how old he was. This just concludes what the Old Testament has to say about him. But
Yeah, you just figure you learn a little bit about the descendants, right?
right,
Because they set up who the descendants of his daughters are.
we have Moab and Ammon continue as nations, and then we do have references to Lot in the New Testament,
Right.
and to his wife for that matter too.
Right.
So I would speculate that perhaps because of the situation with his daughters and having those children, he decided just to continue his own distinct life rather than mingle back with Abraham. That's at least a possibility.
It would be awkward. Also, the way that the terms they kind of left on too were rather, this is mine and this is yours,
Yeah.
and it was pretty. It wasn't like it was pretty final sounding. I
Yeah.
think the way they left.
Could
So
be. Yeah.
it was kind of like that's the way it's supposed to be. Divinely, we're just supposed to be away from each other.
It's interesting though. The Lot comes up even in Psalm 83. Talks about the children of Lot. I guess Ammon and Moab. So as Daniel pointed out, his name comes up in terms of ancestry.
All right, well, thank you for the question. All right, we're going to get into Genesis 28, like I said, 10 through 22. And I'm going to be reading from the Robert Alter translation. And Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran, and he came upon a certain place and stopped there for the night, for the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it at his head, and he laid down in that place. And he dreamed, and look, a ramp was set against the ground with its top reaching the heavens. And look, messengers of God were going up and coming down it. And look, the Lord was poised over him, and he said, excuse me, I, the Lord, am the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, to you I will give it, and to your seed. And your seed shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall burst forth to the west, and the east, and the north, and the south, and all the clans of the earth shall be blessed through you and through your seed. And look, I am with you, and I will guard you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done that which I have spoken to you. And Jacob awoke from his sleep, and he said, Indeed, the Lord is in this place, and I did not know. And he was afraid, and he said, How fearsome is this place! This can be but the house of God, and this is the gate of the heavens. And Jacob rose early in the morning, and took the stone he had put at his head, and he set it as a pillar, and he poured oil over its top. And he called the name of that place Bethel, though the name of the town before had been Luz. And Jacob made a vow, saying, If the Lord God be with me, and guard me on this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I set as a pillar will be a house of God, and everything that you give me I will surely tithe it to you. Okay, so this is the famous Jacob's Ladder, right? We can do that song. We are climbing Jacob's Ladder. Although he actually renders it as a ramp, I think he thinks of it more like a ziggurat is what you should be picturing versus the typical thing. That's what they kind of get at, which is kind of interesting. Different take. Usually you just think of this like not disembodied, but just this random ladder, there. But he thinks of it more as a structure. Considering Jacob eventually builds kind of a bit of a structure, kind of makes sense. So, what are some of the thoughts that come to your mind as you see this?
Well, this has had a very big impact on Jewish culture. Uh, this ladder to the heavens, the numerical value of that term sulam is also the same numerical value as Sinai, Mount Sinai, which was in a way a ladder to the heavens. So, Jewish commentaries would point that out. Also, in the 14th verse, there's a movement among the Jews called Chabad that some of you may be familiar with, and their theme song comes from Genesis 28:14, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And this is kind of their theme song. And the term in Hebrew, you shall spread forth, ufaratzta, the numerical value of that is 770, which is the address of the headquarters of Chabad, 770 Eastern Parkway. So that's just a little bit of culture there. There's also an interesting commentary on what it says about the angels. Uh, it talks about angels ascending and descending on
Mm-hmm.
it, and so the tradition is if the angels are in heaven, it should say they were descending and then ascending.
Right.
Why does it say that they're ascending
Mm.
first? And the idea is because when you go to the land of Israel, you're ascending.
Mm.
And that's the whole Jewish tradition of Aliyah, that going to Israel is an ascent, an
Mm.
Aliyah. So that's, again, a little bit of Jewish culture there.
Yeah.
But Bethel means house of God. And, this was this dream once again confirms God's promise that ultimately they would have a land of their own, and this would be it.
Mm-hmm.
Even though now he's heading into exile, so
Right.
it's a way of encouraging him in this exile. And frankly, he didn't know. I believe he had no idea how long he was going to be gone.
Right.
It wasn't supposed to last like as long as it did,
Right.
and so this would have been an encouragement to him. If I may go on just a bit further,
No.
um,
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
but I believe that what he's saying in verse 22 is, when I come back, whatever wealth I have acquired, I will give a tenth to God at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I presume some kind of ministry was going on in the land of Canaan, that maybe the Melchizedek ministry was continuing, or maybe his father Isaac was
Mm.
conducting some sort of ministry. It's kind of interesting here. He's going to give a tenth to God, but how does
Yeah.
he do that?
Who?
How does he do that?
To whom?
I would say there was some kind of ministry going
Mm.
on in the land of Canaan,
Interesting.
and when he promised that when he returned, whatever wealth he had acquired, he would give a tenth.
Mm-hmm.
So we have here a Jacob giving a tenth, and we have Abraham earlier giving a tenth. So we do see in Genesis the principle established
Right.
of maaser, of the tithe.
Right. It is interesting because it's kind of like the story of where you have like who is Cain's wife. You have this question of who are these other people that they're interacting with, because often you read these stories and you think, well, God's people are just so like just this little clump, and perhaps that isn't actually the case. That's kind of interesting.
The Jews have a tradition that there was an academy of Shem and Eber
Mm,
functioning in the land at that time. But
sure.
that's what I would call legendary.
Yeah. Well, Abraham had a fair amount of kids,
Yeah,
and then they would have had kids by now.
yeah,
So there could be a fair amount of other people that are that
yeah.
are worshipers of God around. It's not
Right.
impractical to think
Yeah.
so. Um, so it says it's interesting the way it's worded because it says he came upon a certain place, so it gives it like this ambiguous, we don't know where it is, and eventually it's going to be defined for us, right? So it's kind of from a narrative perspective, it's kind of interesting. And then later Jacob says, well, I didn't know God was here, right? So it's like a most inauspicious place or whatever you want to say. You know what I mean? It's like it's this place that didn't really seem to be very distinctive, and then this incredibly distinctive thing happens. And then, sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting. It talks about pouring oil on it to
Mm-hmm.
consecrate it. That comes up
Yep.
later on. And of course, Jesus Christ is
Right.
the anointed one, the
Right.
Mashiach or Christos.
And the chief cornerstone. So
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, another point. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Now the interesting thing about that is that isn't the whole idea of like setting up a pillar later considered wrong? Isn't that something that Deuteronomy gets on about?
Once there was a fixed place of worship, the sanctuary, the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness. Once God had established where worship should take place, he told them not to set up their own
Uh-huh.
local altars. But this would have been, of course, well before that.
Right, right, right. But it's just interesting because I know some people take it negatively in a way. It's like this is what he was doing because this is just kind of the pagan practices he was aware of, and this wasn't really the best way to go about it. And he was just kind of doing what he thought was best, and actually, um, you know what I mean? And I don't know if that's necessarily accurate. I kind of like your
Mm,
take better, where it's just something that progressed over time. It would be a shame to think that he had this
yeah.
wonderful vision and then proceeded to do something
Uh,
pagan and inappropriate as a result of it. I don't
now,
like that.
now some of you may be really shocked, but I think I might want to bring this up. There, there, there's there actually is a tradition among some people
Uh huh.
that's I don't want to get into all the background of it,
Okay.
but there was a stone on which the
Mm.
Scottish king was coronated, and then it moved to England, and it became the stone on which British kings were coronated and queens,
Yep.
like Elizabeth II. But then it was returned to Scotland, I think, 700 years later. It was 1291, I think, is when it came to England from Scotland, and then in 1990, when I think they returned the stone to Scotland. But there were some people who believed that that stone was Jacob's, somehow the stone that he made into a pillow here,
Mm.
or a barrier for his head, whatever,
Right.
however you want to understand it.
Right.
Okay, well, evidently tests were done on it to show that it wasn't from the Middle East.
Hmm.
It wasn't a Middle Eastern stone.
Shocking.
At some point, some test
I'm
was
sorry.
done
That
to
was
show
rude.
that the origin of that stone was not the Middle East. So
Hmm.
I just thought I might mention that.
Yeah. Well, it kind of speaks against making ritualistic symbols out of random stuff. But the whole like sleeping on the stone too. Again, you kind of get this like resting on the stone. Build your house on the rock. So that's nice symbolism there. Also, it's humble, right? Because he goes from that to a lot of promises, and he's like, "You're going to give me, if you give me all this stuff, I'm going to give you stuff back." And here he is sleeping on a stone. So it's a nice parallel there as well. A nice contrast. But it's interesting when he says, "The Lord is in this place, and I did not know," because that's kind of a strange. It seems. Are you supposed to take from that Jacob just was very poor in his understanding of God's omnipresence, or are you supposed to take that as more of this is like the place, like kind of like the temple, where it's not like they didn't think he was omnipresent, but there was specific divine places, right? How do you interpret that? Because it's also interesting too, because what happens next is Jacob kind of barters with God in a kind of strange way too, because he's like, well, if you do all this stuff for me, then yeah, I'm gonna totally, fear you and all of this. And that's kind of a weird starting point too. It's not generally what you would describe as like a typical converted mind, if that makes it. Not to be too mean to Jacob, but you know what I mean. Like the all of this conversation doesn't come across like a typical converted person. So what do you make of all that?
Well, Jacob is not looked upon as a converted person really until
Until the
perhaps
wrestling,
perhaps
maybe.
perhaps the wrestling.
Yeah.
Yeah, he goes from Jacob to Israel. That's really the
Hmm.
conversion.
Fair
He
enough.
goes from a heel to one who overcomes with God.
Yeah. Okay. I was kind of
Zero to
thinking.
hero. I
I
was
was
thinking of
kind
the
of
song
thinking
Zero
that. I
to
was
Hero.
kind of thinking that as well. This kind of shows that spiritual maturity, right? He
Right.
starts with just the recognition that God exists, and then he gets to the omnipresence, and then he gets to the fact that there's, you know, there's a there's a there's a push and shove about honoring and blessings and things like that, and then eventually he gets to a better place, spiritually speaking.
Well, he is expecting from this promise that God gives him in the 14th verse. I think he's expecting that even though he's you know starting out from scratch
Right.
as he goes to his relatives there in Syria, but he is expecting that God will bless him based upon this promise. So,
Right.
in effect, he's saying, as you confirm your promise to me,
Yeah.
I will also make this,
Right.
commitment to you.
Yeah.
It's not quite as
That's what I'm saying, because there are times when God speaks to his people in the same way. He's like, if you do this, I'll do this. But it doesn't mean they're not his people otherwise.
right,
So you could be more generous with him and say
right.
he's implying that he's going to do that anyway, and he's just. This is more maybe speaking to the way he frames his thinking, which is the way that Jacob seems to be. He seems to be very transactional. It may not be quite as poor as I just made it out to be. So I think you got some wiggle room there on how generous you want to be to Jacob's spiritual progress at this point.
Yeah, I wouldn't get too cynical about how he worded it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I just find it interesting because it is different. All right. Any other? Oh wait, I had another thought, and that is when he says, "This land where you lay, I will give to you." That has been pointed out, and I think this is interesting that he does make a big deal later that he does not want to be buried in Egypt, and I kind of wonder if that was on in the back of his mind, even though I don't
Yeah.
think it was necessarily implying that, but it's like, no, I don't want to actually lie in a place where I'm not, my ancestors were not inheriting. I want to be there.
Well, Joseph also wanted to be,
Right.
brought back. It strikes me. It's interesting. He says that in verse 22, this stone that I have set as a pillar shall be God's house. So evidently, at least temporarily, and
Mm-hmm.
that at that time in history, Bethel was a center of worship, at least for
Right.
a time. And there were other
Right.
places, like
Right.
Shiloh, that for a period of time was a center of worship.
Right. And that's where I could say you could get a less cynical view than Jacob not realizing God is omnipresent with his this is where you are. It could be this is where you are as in like the tabernacle,
Right,
which is not the same thing as not believing God is
right,
omnipresent.
right.
So let's be generous to Jacob. Why not?
Of course.
I like being generous.
He's a patriarch.
Exactly. Let's go with the nicer read on people. Any other comments? All right. So if you're enjoying this, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, tell your friends. We can read the law together this year, and we will see you tomorrow.